A birth certificate does not record that you were born. You were born regardless. It records a legal event, the moment the administrative state creates the official person. And the compulsory birth registration systems, introduced across the industrialized world in the mid-19th century, required specific information: the father's name, the mother's name, the documented family connection that anchors a new person to an existing genealogical thread. Information that a displaced person arriving without prior documentation could not provide. Their legal existence began at the intake document. Everything before it was officially not there. I want to begin with what a birth certificate actually is, legally and operationally, in the modern administrative state. It is not a record of a biological event. It is a record of a legal event. The biological event, birth, occurred whether or not the registration took place. The legal event, the registration, creates the official person. The person in the eyes of the state. The person who can be taxed, conscripted, licensed, prohibited, imprisoned. The biological person existed before the registration. The legal person begins with the document. This distinction is important. The birth certificate does not record that you were born. You were born regardless. The birth certificate creates your legal identity, your official existence, your standing within the administrative system. And the administrative system's ability to administer you depends entirely on its records of your existence. In a system without birth registration, a person without a record is not invisible to the community. They are known by the people around them. They have a social identity that doesn't require institutional documentation. In a system with universal birth registration, a person without a record is legally invisible. They cannot access any of the services, rights, or protections that the administrative state provides. They cannot be administered, and they cannot, in any formal sense, prove that they exist. The history of how birth registration became universal is a history of the administrative state claiming the definition of legal personhood as exclusively its own. The specific timeline of that claim corresponds, with the consistency I keep finding in these investigations, to the specific timeline of the Tartarian erasure and the inheritance period. The mid-19th century, the period when the population displacement I've been tracking was at its most intensive, the period when the orphan train networks were processing undocumented individuals into the documentary record, is the same period when civil birth registration was being introduced, standardized, and made compulsory across the industrialized world. The introduction of compulsory birth registration in England in 1874, followed by 20 years the inception of the orphan train system in New York. The timing is not coincidental. The orphan train system was creating paper identities for individuals who arrived in the processing system without them. Civil birth registration was establishing the norm that paper identities were the only legitimate ones. The two systems worked together, one creating papers for the undocumented, one making the absence of papers the definition of non-existence. The population that had arrived from the reset without documentation was being absorbed into a documentary framework that, once established as universal, would make the origins of anyone without papers simply unaskable, because without papers you have no origin. You have only the papers you're given, and the papers you're given say what the system decided to say. The specific design of the birth registration systems is worth examining closely. The English Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act of 1836. The foundational legislation that preceded compulsory registration required the recording of the following information: date of birth, name, sex, father's name and occupation, mother's name. 5 categories. 5 data points that create the official record of a person's entry into the world and their connection to a family network. What the system required, and what it required specifically, is information that a person embedded in a documented family network can provide, and that a person arriving without prior documentation cannot. The father's name, the mother's name, the family connection that anchors the new person to a documented genealogical thread. A person without documented parents cannot provide the required information. A person who was found, in the institutional sense I described in an earlier investigation, cannot be registered at birth because there is no birth event in the record. Their paper existence begins at the moment of intake, not at birth, and the intake document, whatever it records, does not have the authority of the birth registration. It creates a weaker form of legal identity, one that is always somewhat provisional, always marked by the gap between the founding document and the birth that should precede it. This weakness was structural, designed. The birth registration system required exactly the information that undocumented individuals could not provide, creating a permanent class of people whose paper identity was second tier, whose legal standing was always somewhat dependent on the goodwill of the institutions that had created their first document. A class of people who were, in the legal sense, manageable in ways that fully documented individuals with continuous genealogical records were not. Because the fully documented person has an anchor, a prior record, a genealogical thread that predates the current administrative system, and that the administrative system cannot revise without revising the historical record itself. The person whose identity begins at an intake document has no such anchor. Their legal existence is entirely a product of the administrative system. The system can be more flexible in managing people who have no existence outside the system's own records. The population I'm tracking, the undocumented individuals who were processed through the intake institutions and the orphan train networks in the mid to late 19th century, became this class. Their descendants, whose genealogical research typically hits a wall at the founding document, the intake record, or the processing certificate, or the adoption paper, are this class's legacy. They are Americans, Australians, Canadians, whose family history begins in the mid-19th century and goes no further back. Not because their ancestors had no prior history, because the documentation of that history did not survive the reset, and the administrative system that replaced the reset civilization was specifically designed, in its birth registration requirements, to make the absence of prior documentation permanent and structural, rather than temporary and recoverable. Consider what would have been required to document the genealogical continuity of a person arriving from the displaced Tartarian population. Prior records, in whatever documentary form the Tartarian administrative tradition used, that could have been accepted as equivalent to the birth certificates the new system required. Records that, if they existed at all, would have been in the archive systems that burned, in the maps that were redrawn, in the documentary tradition of a civilization that the new administrative order was engaged in systematically denying had existed. A person arriving from that tradition with their original documentation, if such a thing survived, would have arrived with documents that the new system would not recognize. Documents in scripts or languages that the new system's administrators could not read. Documents from an institutional tradition the new system's administrators had no framework for evaluating. Documents from, officially, nowhere. So the new system issued its own documents. And in issuing them, it determined what information those documents would record and what information they would not. The new documents recorded the person's entry into the new system. They did not record, could not record, would not record the person's prior existence in the system that the new documents were designed to replace. The paper identity that the birth registration system created was a clean start, a founding document with no backward reference, a beginning without a before. This is what the birth certificate system was designed to produce, among its other genuine functions. A population for whom official identity begins with the state's documentation of it. A population whose legal existence is entirely a product of the administrative system, and therefore entirely dependent on it. A population that cannot make historical claims about prior existence in a different civilization, prior membership in a different administrative tradition, prior rights under a different legal framework, because those claims require documentation that the system that replaced that civilization was carefully designed not to recognize. The Tartarian heritage is not just unacknowledged, it is, by the structural requirements of the modern birth registration system, undocumentable, not by accident, by design. If the birth registration systems of the mid-19th century was specifically designed to require the information that undocumented individuals couldn't provide, creating a permanent class of people whose legal identity is entirely a product of the administrative system, whose genealogical heritage was structurally made undocumentable. And does that design still serve its original function today? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this if your own family tree hits a wall somewhere in the 1800s.